Hello and welcome to today's A Slice of Medieval. On today's podcast we have the author and historian and a good friend, Matthew Lewis, who has a particular interest in the medieval period. He's renowned for his research on Richard III. I would say he's one of the go-to people for Richard III these days, and is chairman of the Richard III Society. The host of the popular podcast Gone Medieval, Matthew has also written about Henry III, Stephen and Matilda, Richard Duke of York, and the medieval power couple Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. And rather than discussing Richard III, which I'm sure Matthew thoroughly enjoys but gets a lot of, today we're going to talk about Henry and Eleanor, the founders of the Plantagenet dynasty and probably the most famous medieval couple. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Henry and Eleanor, what attracts people to their story?
I just think it's got a little bit of everything. You know, it's high politics that spans Western Europe. There's so many wars. I mean, Henry has this incredible ability to reduce castles by sieges faster than anybody imagines is possible. So he's achieving things that nobody thinks is achievable in his age. It's the building of empire. There is intrigue at every turn. There are plots and games going on, particularly with the Capetian kings in Paris as their reigns go on. So it's these elements of the political, but also the personal, because this is all family drama as well. This is all their personal relationships. This is watching a married couple play out their relationship in the public eye, but also getting to watch them fall out spectacularly with their sons and everything else as well. I mean, it's as close as I think you can get to a medieval version of EastEnders or something. You know, it's that looking in through the window and seeing the inner workings of a family who are otherwise utterly untouchable and disconnected from us, but yet they seem so human and relevant today in the way that they interact with each other.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking when you were saying that, I was thinking of the show Succession, which I think is kind of that sort of thing, isn't it? The interrelationships between the children and the father, and the occasion and the intervention of the mother. It's sort of got that kind of internecine rivalry and interfamily rivalry. It's very much very attractive to the viewer, the listener, the reader.
I think so, because it always has that element of looking, you know, you're peering behind the curtain, aren't you? You know, the same with those stories like Succession and things like that. You're looking in through the windows of people's homes and you're seeing what goes on behind the scenes of all these huge power events that are being played out in public, but you get that little look at what's happening in private as well.
And I mean, Henry was an enormously powerful man. I mean, at the time, I suppose there were others, but you can't get too much more powerful than Henry II. I mean, he spanned a large geographical area as well.
Well, that's it. I mean, you know, he holds territories from, you know, the North Sea to the Pyrenees Mountains. You know, he holds more of France than the King of France does. That's why he's such a threat to them. He becomes, throughout his reign, he becomes the person that European rulers go to try and settle their problems. He's seen as that kind of power almost above all of the other rulers of Europe. He has this connection to the Holy Land as well. So his granddad had gone off to become King of Jerusalem. And at one point, the Patriarch of Jerusalem comes over and pretty much begs Henry to go and be King of Jerusalem for them, because he's just seen as this man who can fix anything. You know, he can run these vast territories and he does such an incredible job and he's so impressive that Jerusalem want him to go and be their king too. So I think he does. even in his own lifetime, I think he's a bit of a legend even in his own lifetime. He's been a legend ever since, but to people around him, even to other kings, he was the person that they turned to. And I think one of the most striking relationships as well is you've got Louis VII in France, who's big kind of Capetian rivalry. But when Louis dies, he's succeeded by his young son, Philip, who will become Philip Augustus. And Philip really looks on Henry as a mentor and a tutor, and Henry is really, really good to Philip, so that when Philip turns on Henry, it's a really poor repayment for the way that Henry has tried to support him on his throne, particularly at a point when Henry might have decided to try and pinch that throne for himself, but he doesn't. He supports Philip Augustus and he backs him up, and he kind of tutors him and teaches him and nurtures him, and then has to watch him turn on him at the last minute. So, we're back to the realms of succession and all of those kinds of things there, where at that last minute, there's a really poor repayment for what Henry has done.
Sharon alluded to the fact that you are somewhat well known for writing and talking about Richard III. So why, in terms of your sort of personal work, why did you turn to Henry and Eleanor? Exciting and interesting though you've just told us it is, was there any other reason, or was it just something that seemed like a good thing to go into?
I guess people might get bored of me talking about Richard III all the time. No, surely not. I wrote a book about the anarchy, and I think that was partly because I've always been fascinated by the Wars of the Roses. So whilst I focus on Richard III and stuff around the princes in the Tower and whatever else, really the Wars of the Roses is the period that's always absolutely fascinated me. And I've written a history of the Wars of the Roses, I've written biography of Richard, Duke of York, Richard III, things like that. And so I decided to write a book about the anarchy, simply because there's another civil war. So I was quite interested to find out how different it was, how similar it was, the kinds of politics and power that was being played out a few centuries earlier, before the Wars of the Roses. So I wrote that book. I tried to write it from the points of view of both Stephen and Matilda, which I think you tend to get a book about Stephen or a book about Matilda that sort of tells their story through the anarchy, but you don't often get a story of the anarchy that looks at it from both their perspectives, because I'm not sure that either of them were particularly bad people or even particularly good people. I don't know. I found Stephen, a much nicer man than I was expecting. I liked him more than I thought I was going to.
I think he's a bit of a wuss, though.
Yeah, but I don't think he was an incompetent fool.
No.
I think he falls into that category of, which several people do through the medieval period. He falls into that category of being too nice to be a good medieval king.
Yeah, that's the thing. He's a nice guy. Yeah,
I don't think we ought to still view that as a failing. We tend to still cling to this kind of really 19th century Whiggish view of our medieval history, that the good kings are the ones that kill loads of people and invade everybody's territory, and the bad ones are the ones that want to stay at home and look after their family and all that kind of thing, where I think today, surely we would view that the other way round. And Matilda, was an absolutely incredible figure as well. Henry II's mother, so this is a woman who has had such a huge impact on Henry. And when you look at Henry's life, he's got such a powerful woman in his mother, and then such a powerful woman in his wife. I think it says a lot about Henry that he's happy to be around these hugely powerful women. He doesn't feel threatened by them at all. And so having told the story of the anarchy, it kind of felt like then I'd left Henry having taken the throne, and he just married Eleanor of Aquitaine, and it's like, this seems like a really rubbish place to leave them. Now I want to know a little bit more about them. So it was almost like this biography was a sequel to the anarchy, and I tried to approach it in the same way as the anarchy, as a kind of joint biography of the two of them, because although much of their story is together, so much of it is apart as well, that it's hard to tell one story without telling the other, I think.
Yes.
Yeah, I like the way that works, that you're telling it's not just Henry. Most biographies throughout the study of history has been about a particular person, and they, all the biographies of kings mention the wives, have a chapter on the wives, but they're always sort of sidelined. So it's nice to actually see Eleanor front and centre as well as Henry.
Yeah, and I think in this couple's case in particular, it's impossible to tell one story without the other. It's impossible to understand one of their characters, one of their successes, and failures and everything else without understanding the person who was standing next to them throughout all of this. And at various points they were driving each other, probably holding each other back, counselling each other. You know, they were each other's solace in moments of grief, I think. And it's striking how you see that throughout their relationship. So trying to tell Henry's story without Eleanor is almost impossible. And I mean, to some extent, it's easier to tell Eleanor's story without Henry because he's only a relatively small part of her life, whereas she is part of pretty much all of his life. So it just felt like a really nice way to tell this story of kind of European politics, to get the couple that drove it all together and to tell their story jointly. You know, they lived these moments together. Why not tell the story together?
Yeah, I think it works really well. So Eleanor of Aquitaine, she's often held up as a feminist icon. You see it everywhere. Eleanor was the first feminist. But how much power did she actually wield herself?
I'm not sure Eleanor would recognise herself as any kind of feminist icon.
No, I don't think so.
Especially not as a first, because what she was doing was latching onto the dying of female power. She had so many strong women in her lineage to look back on who had ruled territories and held power, that she was, you know, that was a moment that was passing. As the Catholic Church gets more and more power, they necessarily think women shouldn't have any kind of authority, and it's the monks in their cloisters that are making women unsuitable for any kind of power and authority. And to some extent, I think Eleanor is, you know, she is the last burning bit of sun at the sunset of female power being an acceptable thing across Europe for centuries to follow. So I don't think she was the first kind of feminist icon, if she was any kind of a feminist icon. And I also think she was utterly proficient at operating within the accepted norms of female power, that kind of soft power that women, that queens were able and expected to operate. She knew very well how to pull all of those levers. Her influence over Louis when she's Queen of France is what turns all of Louis's court against her, because they're worried that, I mean, the chroniclers frequently talk about Louis being like a child, obsessed with Eleanor. You know, he's in love like a puppy. He follows her around everywhere. He does everything that she says. So clearly they think she has plenty of influence over Louis. They categorize it as a bad thing, but that's a queen knowing how to use those levers of power. You know, she manages to get Louis involved in a war with one of his subjects to champion her sister. You know, when her sister has an affair with a married man, she manages to get Louis to sort of start a war off the back of that. As part of her position in Aquitaine, she believes she should hold the county of Toulouse. That's been in dispute for a long time. And she manages to get Louis to take an army all the way down to Toulouse to pick a fight down there for her. So she's clearly very, very good at doing all of that kind of thing. And that's not her wielding power. That's her knowing how to direct the kind of soft power that she has, how to pull those levers in the right ways. When she marries Henry and he becomes, you know, Count of Anjou, Duke of Normandy, King of England, and then Duke of Aquitaine in right of her, she is frequently acting as regent across a variety of his lands. She's regent in England, she's regent in Normandy, she's regent in Anjou a couple of times. And so the fact that they've got this huge dispersed set of territories means that it's difficult for Henry to manage all of that by himself. So he doesn't have to, because he's got a partner and he can rely on her. And she is perfectly comfortable, again, operating in the way that women are expected to operate in during this period. She's representing the power of her husband. She's representing the power of a man. And she's perfectly capable of doing that. She doesn't particularly, you know, fight against that idea. She operates incredibly well within those bounds. And I think perhaps the striking thing is that when she does get power in her own right, so later on in her relationship with Henry, she goes to Aquitaine and she's left to rule Aquitaine sort of on her own, to train their son Richard, who is going to be the future Duke of Aquitaine. Or at least that's the plan. Plans never work out, obviously. And she does have, you know, power there then as Duchess of Aquitaine. And this is frequently seen as some distance coming into their relationship. So it's often painted as the time when Henry begins to take young mistresses and that he's sort of shipping Eleanor off out of the way. I would actually argue that what this is a great big fat thank you from Henry. This is the golden handshake. This is Eleanor at the end of her child rearing years. She's provided him with endless sons and daughters. She's done a fantastic job helping him to rule all of these lands. I think Eleanor has always been fixated on Aquitaine. The belief that Richard is her favourite son really centres around the idea that he is the future of Aquitaine. He's going to be the next Duke of Aquitaine. That's always been her focus. She's always seemed to have wanted to go back to Aquitaine. So I think when Henry lets her go back there as Duchess with authority to rule herself, it's everything that she ever wanted. It's not a slap down from Henry. I think it's a big thank you. But this is the moment where we see her exercising power and authority in her own right, and it really doesn't go very well. She doesn't do a very good job of it. She hits all kinds of problems, rebellious vassals. She's not sure how to deal with it, and I think that plays into Henry and Eleanor's later relationship. But as I think she is incredibly effective when she is operating as Louis's wife, as Henry's wife, within those accepted norms. When she does get power in her own right and try to step out of that, she doesn't deal particularly well with the backlash that she gets from men who still at this point don't want to be ruled by a woman, really.
Yeah, is that because they're comfortable with her representing the power of a king, but they're not so comfortable with her being the source of the power?
It is, I think. And this is a period in which the church particularly is fostering this idea that women can't wield power, shouldn't be trusted with power. And I'm looking at Sharon and I'm really sorry because I know how awful all of this sounds when I'm saying it out loud.
No, I've just written the book on the anarchy as well, so I'm like, yes, because it's Empress Matilda. Everybody hated her because she tried to wield power in her own right. Matilda of Boulogne, King Stephen's wife, she's perfect because although she also led an army, she was doing it for Stephen, so she was on the right side.
It's exactly that. And I think Eleanor just falls into this moment when she believes she can still do this stuff, and she probably could, but society is just shifting away from the idea that she should be allowed to do this stuff. Aquitaine is an incredibly difficult place to rule at the best of times. It's kind of a really loose gathering of counties that are held together by kind of the finest threads of loyalty. You pull any of those ties too sharply and they will snap and you've lost the whole thing. And so dukes, they're counts of Poitou, the Dukes of Aquitaine, and they sit in Poitou in the north of Aquitaine, desperately trying to manage all of these relationships. And I think the fact that Eleanor is a woman gives men the idea that they have even more space to dissent than they would if she was a Duke of Aquitaine, and they make the absolute most of that. They don't particularly want to be ruled by a woman. If I was being fair to them, I might suggest that Aquitanian independence is an incredibly important thing. And female rule always brings with it this question of how are you going to put an army into the field? As you've just mentioned, Matilda of Boulogne can do it because she's doing it on Stephen's behalf. Empress Matilda can't do it because women can't lead an army onto the battlefield. If Matilda's half-brother Robert of Gloucester is doing it, isn't he really king? It raises all of those kinds of questions. Yeah. If Eleanor wants to put an army into the field, she could possibly do it in Henry's name, she could possibly do it in Richard's name, but then is she really Duchess? Or is she just representing them? So she tries to operate in her own right, but it raises all of those questions. And I think Aquitaine is such a tricky place at the best of times that it's a bad time for Eleanor to be there trying to be a woman pulling on those levers of power, if that makes sense. And I think, like I say, I don't want to be fair to them because they're just a horrible bunch of misogynists who don't want to be ruled by a woman. But if I was being fair to them, I might suggest that with an eye to Aquitanian independence, they'd be thinking, does this work?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds as if sort of catch-22 for Eleanor, really. She can't really win in that situation that she's in. In terms of her personal relationship with Henry, which you touched on earlier, where did that all go wrong? Because if they were such great partners in the early part of the reign, how did it? It's a Baldric question, really, isn't it? How did the war start? How did it happen that they fell out in what appears, at least, to be a very spectacular way?
I think they never fall out, and I think that appearance of a spectacular falling out is precisely what they wanted everyone to see. And this is just my theory. So traditional history will tell us that they have this huge fallout. So around 1173, their sons rebel against their father, and the traditional version of this story is that Eleanor kind of eggs them on. And to some extent, I've always got an eye to this is monks telling us this, sitting in their cloisters, going, something's gone horribly wrong. Where's the woman we can blame? Oh, there she is. It's Eleanor.
Yeah.
So I always take that view with a pinch of salt. I'm always cautious about, if I go back to thinking about Richard III, I remember my A-level history teacher telling me, you need to think about who is telling you this thing and why are they telling it you.
Yeah.
What do they want you to understand? And I think quite often here, monks don't want to blame a king. They're happy to look for a woman to blame. And Eleanor gets kind of singled out for this. And so traditional history tells us that Eleanor eggs her sons on to rebel, that she then tries to go to her ex-husband in Paris to operate against her current husband, which seems like madness to me. Why would a woman do that? It doesn't make any sense at all. That she's captured en route, and that then she spends kind of...
Don't forget she was dressed as a man.
Of course, yeah, because she has to be unnatural at this point. So, she's behaving so beyond what's acceptable for a woman that she's even wearing men's clothes and riding a horse like a man. Do you think of anything more shocking? And then she spends the rest of Henry II's life, so the next 15 years, in what is characterised as captivity, as his prisoner. So my suggestion, and again, this is my interpretation of what happened in that period. My suggestion for these events around 1173 is that we can see Louis VII, the Capetian king, is beginning this game that the Capetians will play against the Angevins and then later kings of England, almost indefinitely from Paris, of getting into their personal relationships. Louis is trying to insert himself between Henry and his sons because he needs to break up those Angevin territories. As I said before, Henry owns more of France than the King of France does, and that is a huge threat to Louis on his throne in Paris. He's not that dissimilar from the Dukes of Aquitaine in that his ties of power are quite loose around France. He's nominal overlord of all of these counts and dukes, but he has to be careful because he doesn't really have all that much actual authority. He's not like the King of England, who has direct control over all of his lands and territories, and sort of dukes and earls are his representatives. For the King of France, it's much more nuanced than that, so he has to be careful. So the lands that Henry and Eleanor hold are an incredible threat to Louis, and I think his solution to this is to get between Henry and his sons. So he starts telling their oldest son, Henry the Young King, why haven't you got any power? Why didn't your dad give you some stuff? Why aren't you Duke of Normandy? Why aren't you King of England already? What's going on with all of this? And Henry the Young King is stupid enough to fall for it, but he does it with the other brothers as well. And so I think in 1173, that rebellion is Louis's magic beginning to work. It's the honey that he's pouring into those boys' ears beginning to bear fruit for him. And I think if you tie this in with the fact that Eleanor's time in Aquitaine has not gone very well, she's had what she wanted, she's had a stab at power in Aquitaine, and it hasn't gone very well. I think that rebellion of 1173 presents an opportunity for her to get out of Aquitaine without looking like she's turning her back on it and running away, to move into a more safe, comfortable retirement in England as Queen of England, and also for them as a couple to take the sting out of Louis courting their sons. Louis wants a division between Henry and their sons, and I think Eleanor is almost the sacrificial lamb who puts herself in the middle of that and says, I'll take a hit here so that you can not blame our sons and that you can publicly be reconciled with them incredibly quickly. Because Henry is, with his sons and even with other, English and Norman barons, he forgives them all almost immediately. And yet Eleanor is seen as someone who's punished for 15 years for perhaps trying to get to Paris at some point. I mean, it's so unreasonable a punishment that it strikes me that perhaps Eleanor's said, I'll just come and go and live at Old Sarum in my favourite castle in England, which doesn't seem like much of a punishment. You can provide me with a pretty good household, loads of nice clothes and everything, which doesn't seem like much of a punishment. And you can forgive our sons and you can stop Louis's game kind of in its tracks. So I'm not sure that anything ever really went wrong with their relationship. And during that 15 years that's characterised as captivity, we still see Eleanor at family events with her sons. She's still at Christmas and Easter courts and things like that. She still mingles with her sons and her daughters.
Yeah, and she's living with Matilda. Matilda comes to live with her, doesn't she, when she is exiled from Germany?
Yeah, so when Matilda's husband, Henry the Lion, kind of falls foul of the Holy Roman Emperor and gets sent into exile, they come and live in England with, Henry shacks up with his in-laws, and Matilda is with Eleanor. But she's frequently at court around their sons, which would seem a crazy thing to do if she's in prison for driving them into rebellion against their father. When Henry the young king dies, it seems that Eleanor is not only allowed to go over to Rouen to visit his tomb, which would be, again, a slightly strange thing for Henry to do if he's mad at her and punishing her and might blame her for Henry's death. But Henry begins to spend more and more time in Eleanor's company at this point too, almost as if they are still each other's solace. She is still the one that he turns to when he's grieving. It's her that he wants. And so I'm not sure that anything did go wrong. I think this was, we can clearly see Louis's tactic to break up the Angevin family and the Angevin lands. I think this is Henry and Eleanor's tactic in response to that. And I think perhaps we missed it. That's my suggestion anyway.
It's not an uncommon tactic, is it, in trying to weaken ruling houses, to drive a wedge between father and son or brothers, as we know from the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we don't allow is that Henry and Eleanor might have had their own response to that.
Yeah.
That was a way of countering what they could see that Louis was trying to do. I'm sure that they could see it, and they must have been so frustrated and annoyed and confused that their sons couldn't see it and fell for it over and over and over again. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have their own tactic in response to this to try and take the sting out of what Louis was doing.
How does that parting of the two, how does that fit in with Henry's character? Because, I mean, again, my knowledge of Henry's fairly superficial, but I get the impression that he's quite a sort of passionate guy in the short term. But as you said, he forgives people generally quite quickly for quite significant betrayals. So are you basically arguing that it's more in character to see that split as a kind of arranged split rather than him punishing her for 15 years?
Yeah, I think so. I think Henry has a very short fuse. Lots of the chroniclers will talk about him being really red-faced and prone to outbursts of anger and all of that kind of thing. And so if he knows that that's the way he behaves, they can almost manufacture, they could stage manage this moment in which he's like, oh my God, Eleanor, I can't believe you've betrayed me in this terrible way. Off you go to your favourite castle of Old Sarum where you'll be punished with robes and furs and all of this kind of thing. And that it's kind of, I imagine them parting with a wink at each other. I mean, The Lion in Winter is such a great film to watch that dynamic between Henry and Eleanor. And I know it's fiction, but it's, for me, I imagine that's what their relationship was very much like, that they are absolute equals. And I think one of the striking things about Henry is that he really, as I said before, he's got this incredibly powerful mother, incredibly powerful wife. I don't think he has an issue with having an equal alongside him in a way that a lot of other kings need their wives to be subordinate to them, to follow that one step behind, to be the quiet peacemaker in the corner, to play that role. I don't think Henry has an issue with Eleanor being his equal in the things that they're trying to achieve. And so I can perfectly imagine them stage managing this huge row about how terrible it is she's been awful to him. And then she's, very gently dragged away to Old Sarum. And as they part, like I say, they turn back to each other and just give a little wink on the way out the door. It worked.
Right, well, you've answered my next question already, so I'm going to put a new one in, and hopefully it's not too big a curveball for you. Henry's relationships, of course, were not just with Eleanor of Aquitaine. He's known to have had a few mistresses. The main one everyone talks about with relation to Eleanor is Rosamund Clifford. And there are many stories where there's a maze to Rosamund's quarters so that Eleanor can't find her, and Eleanor stabbing Rosamund or poisoning Rosamund. I never found anything that suggested that Eleanor met Rosamund, was threatened by Rosamund. Do you think Eleanor was threatened by Henry's mistresses, or she just saw it as Henry's doing Henry and it doesn't affect me?
I mean, I think it's widely understood that kings at this time had mistresses. You know, Henry I had, what did he have, 20-something illegitimate children?
22 illegitimate children.
You know, and Henry II kind of modelled himself on his granddad Henry I. Maybe not in this way, he didn't have that many illegitimate children. But it wasn't unusual for kings to have mistresses. And again, I think Eleanor would have understood the role that she was in. She's a king's wife. Her job is to produce heirs to support him. I think she does that in more effective ways and more direct ways than some other queens. But particularly when she is, you know, into her mid to late 40s, she's perhaps not going to have any more children with Henry. She goes off to Aquitaine to this what I would term as comfortable retirement. She gets that golden handshake of, you know, thank you very much. I'm not sure that she's too bothered that then she knows Henry is still sleeping with other women at that point. Kind of, it's not the biggest thing on her mind at that point. So the Rosamund Clifford stuff, it's like the idea that Eleanor was involved in these courts of love, you know, with her daughters. It just didn't exist. It's not a thing. It didn't happen. The Rosamund Clifford stuff is just more kind of chivalric romance that builds up around this story that Rosamund is this kind of innocent mistress. Eleanor, again, she has to be this slightly vicious, nasty woman who is looking for vengeance. And so she, you know, Henry has to construct this huge maze around this cottage for Rosamund to live in, where she becomes an effective prisoner in this cottage so that Eleanor can't get to her, but Eleanor still does get to her and manages to either stab her or poison her, or, you know, depends which version of the story you get. But I just don't think she would have featured anywhere in Eleanor's thinking. I think the only mistress that perhaps Eleanor might have been concerned about was Ida de Tosney, who was more noble than she might have expected Henry to have as a mistress. And so a noble woman might be more of a threat to her position than a commoner that Henry was having as a mistress. And we know William Longespee would be a son from that relationship, and that is potentially more concerning to Eleanor than someone like Rosamund Clifford, I think. But even then, there's no signal that she's particularly, you know, freaking out or disturbed by Henry having mistresses at all.
I think it comes from, it's that 19th century attitude of what a family has to be. And then it's developed in the 20th and 21st century where everybody has to be in love. You know, and we see 12th and 13th century marriages as the same as ours, where they're arranged marriages, but they all fell in love. And Eleanor didn't have to fall in love with Henry. It was a business dealing for running countries, and yes, they would have had affection for each other. He was more her choice than Louis VII was, but he wasn't someone she would have necessarily chosen to marry if it wasn't for the fact that they both ruled countries. So for her, she's done her duty in producing the children, in supporting Henry. And she may well have just seen it as, actually, this is my reward. You know, Henry's looking elsewhere. I can just be me, have a bit of me time and get on with my life.
Yeah, I mean, you know, to some extent, was she grateful that someone else was taking that pressure off her, you know? And I mean, I would also say that Henry and Eleanor never seem to have had this kind of relationship. Again, you know, it's tempting but dangerous to talk about love. I think what we can say is that Henry and Eleanor were a devastatingly effective couple. They were both incredibly capable people who worked very, very well together. They may have loved each other. They may have at least, you know, cared for each other, had a degree of affection for each other after all of their years together and everything that they'd achieved in their family. But we don't necessarily need to concern ourselves with talking about love in their relationship, and stuff like that can be really dangerous to pick out. But yeah, you know, I think what we can say is that they were incredibly effective together, and they never seem to have spent that much time in each other's company because of the amount of territory that they owned. Because Eleanor was frequently having to operate as Henry's regent in various places, that was a way of them spreading their authority. So they never had the kind of relationship that required them to be in each other's pockets all of the time.
No, and they were apart for months, at least months at a time, sometimes years. I think, wasn't their daughter Matilda about 18 months old or something the first time she saw her father?
Yeah, they do spend huge period, because Henry is having to travel over vast distances and you know, run around putting out fires all over his lands of minor rebellions. They are apart for prolonged periods of time. So yeah, you know, like I say, they never had that kind of relationship that meant they had to be in each other's pockets 24/7. That doesn't mean they didn't care for each other, but it meant that they were used to that kind of physical distance in their relationship because that's the way it had always worked.
I mean, one of the things we haven't yet mentioned, the word we haven't yet mentioned on this is Becket. Now, when I was at school, which I'll admit is a long time ago, it wasn't at 1170, but it was a long time ago. When you were presented with Henry II, it was Henry II and Becket. That was the topic, if you like. It was the big thing. So how do you see the role of Becket in terms of Henry's reign and their falling out and so on, and the importance of it? How do you see it?
One of the things that struck me when I was writing the book really was just how unimportant Henry probably thought Becket was. He is an incredibly good administrator. So Henry latches onto him because he's very, very good at his job. He makes him chancellor, whatever the medieval equivalent of prime minister. He's running the functioning of government. And he's very, very good at that. Henry is, and I guess, we can possibly see some parallels here with someone like Henry VIII and Cardinal Wolsey. Henry isn't very interested in the sparkle and the glitter of being king. He wants to wear his muddy boots and ride around, attacking castles and everything else. He doesn't want to be doing paperwork and counting money and all of that sort of stuff. And so Thomas Becket is very, very good at that kind of thing. And, when Henry wants to organise a wedding between his son, Henry the Young King, and Louis's daughter, so Princess of France, he kind of can't be bothered to go to Paris and make this huge glitzy entrance into Paris, so he sends Thomas to do it. And the chronicles talk about Thomas turning up with a couple of mile longs of wagons, tons of silver everywhere, barrels of beer, there's monkeys riding dogs chained to the carts and all of this kind of stuff. And it almost backfires and has the opposite effect, because everyone is like, well, if this is Henry's chancellor, crikey, imagine what he must be like. But then we get accounts of, Becket will hold these lavish feasts and sort of hold court almost on Henry's behalf. And then Henry will come in from a day's hunting, ride his horse across the middle of Becket's great hall, hop off, jump over the table and put his muddy boots up on the table and start eating. And, you can imagine Becket, head in his hand, sort of, oh my God, he's back. And so I think they work very well together from that point of view. And then Henry has this big idea when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies. As I said, Henry II models himself very much on Henry I, and his measure of everything is, if it's a power or a right or an authority that my granddad had, I want it. And Henry I had much more control over the church than Henry II did. So the Pope in Rome is trying to gather a bit more power for the Catholic Church. You're getting all kinds of arguments around Europe around who can appoint bishops and archbishops and things like this.
Yeah, they had one in Germany, didn't they? The investiture crisis.
That was the word I was looking for, thank you. Yeah, so you've got the investiture crisis going on around this time, lots of discussion. Henry II wants the powers that his granddad Henry I has. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury dies, he sees the perfect opportunity to get his man, Thomas Becket, in. Thomas Becket isn't even a priest. He's no interest in being in the church. Thomas, says to Henry, I don't want to do this. I don't want this position. And to some extent, Thomas is maybe around about 40 at this point. He's not married. And this would be the end of any hope of him getting married, having any children, having a family, but also of any political authority, because Henry only wants to put him there so that he can hand over control of the church and then make his own position of Archbishop of Canterbury kind of redundant. So he'd go from being the most powerful man in Henry's government to being a kind of puppet holding church services on a Sunday and doing whatever Henry tells him to. And I don't think that appeals to Thomas at all. But Henry wants to go ahead with it. So Henry makes him Archbishop of Canterbury, and then Thomas doesn't do what Henry wants. Henry flips out. Thomas ends up in exile. And we do see Henry being quite vicious at this point. Anyone who is related or vaguely connected to Thomas Becket is chased into exile as well, and Henry seizes all their property. So here's his temper, in full flow. And I think from that point, Becket is not really Henry's main problem or his main concern ever again. Becket becomes a bit of a pesky fly that shows up. Every time Henry has a peace conference with Louis, Becket will show up and go, I'm still here. You can't all be friends while I'm still here because Henry's horrible to me. And again, I think you get Henry and Louis head in hands going, oh my God, it's that guy again. And I think it reaches the point where the Pope is fed up of Becket, Louis is fed up of Becket, Henry is fed up of Becket. And they kind of, I think they fabricate this moment when Henry has his son, Henry the Young King, crowned as King of England in his lifetime, only time it happens in English history. but he has it done by the Archbishop of York. And Thomas Becket is utterly outraged, as I think he was meant to be. And I think at this point, Louis and the Pope have had enough of him. He's getting in the way of the kind of peace that they want, because again, they're concerned about how do you get men to the Holy Land to fight a crusade when they're all fighting each other in Europe. And Thomas Becket is getting in the way of all of those efforts. So I think now Thomas is pushed to try and make peace with Henry, with the promise that he can recrown Henry the young king. And Louis, because Louis's daughter is married to Henry the young king and she wasn't included in that coronation, Louis is able to kind of have some faux outrage at, oh, my daughter ought to have been involved in this as well. If only Thomas Becket could do it again, he could crown them both. And so Thomas is sort of lured back to England to do this, but I think he kind of sees what's going on, and he gets back to England, immediately excommunicates everyone that supports Henry, and barricades himself in at Canterbury, and is just continuing to be obstructive, but now on English soil. So I think throughout Henry's reign, although we do talk about Henry and Becket, and because we know how Becket's story ends, and that's such a massive moment, it kind of is allowed to dominate backwards from there. But I think if you look at what Henry's doing and how he's behaving and what he's thinking, I don't think Becket was ever his main concern, really.
And do you think then the fact that Becket was killed, and it's reported obviously by monks and the church and so on, and therefore is a very big thing? I mean, it's a very big thing anyway, because he's killed in his cathedral. But do you think it's the reporting of it, in a sense, that has, and maybe also 19th century historians, that have kind of made it the thing about Henry's reign? Because if you're not careful, as I said, growing up, when I grew up at school and you studied Henry II, it was the only thing that was important in Henry II's reign. It was very skewed.
Yeah, it's those Victorians again, Derek. I keep saying it.
I know it is. Yeah. Macaulay and Trevelyan.
I do think it's easy to exaggerate the importance of Becket, but the danger is going too far the other way, because it was, this is an Archbishop of Canterbury being murdered in his own cathedral.
Yeah.
At least on the suspicion that the king had ordered this to happen. It is a massive moment, but I think it is also a moment. It is not something that dominates Henry's kind of 30 odd years as King of England.
Yeah.
It happens. His enemies will try and use it against him. The King of France and the barons of France are hugely outraged, because it suits them to say, oh, Henry is the devil incarnate now. He's murdering archbishops. What a terrible, terrible man. Let's take all his land off him. Because that suits their aims. And doubtless they are shocked. It's a shocking thing, but they will use it to their advantage too. But I think what's interesting about it then is also that Henry manages to turn it round to his own. And again, if we think perhaps he might have had this plan with Eleanor to deal with the 1173 revolt and all of that kind of thing, Henry understands politics and he understands people and he understands how these things work. When things start to go badly for him and he's facing these rebellions, he comes back to England, and what does he do? He rides not to London, he rides straight to Canterbury. As soon as he gets in sight of Canterbury Cathedral, he gets off his horse, takes his shoes off, walks to Canterbury Cathedral to the point where his feet are bleeding by the time he gets there. He kneels in front of Thomas Becket's tomb, his shrine, and he weeps and apologises to his friend. So now he's calling on this guy who he's suspected of being murdered as an old friend. And he gets the monks at Canterbury to whip him. They're allowed to whip the king. And I think that must have been such a moment when the king's like, just whack my back with a birch branch. And all these monks are like, are you sure? I don't know if hitting the king is a very good idea. But, this happens. And then we're told that night, as he's praying to Thomas Becket, the King of Scotland is captured at Alnwick, and the rebellion against Henry falls apart. And the masterstroke there is that all of medieval society can only see one thing happening there. That's God at work. God and St. Thomas have just forgiven Henry II. So now he's got this man that he's suspected of having murdered, who has been sainted almost immediately and is held up as this great martyr in all of Western Europe for centuries to follow, is now on Henry's side. He's now backing Henry. God and St. Thomas love Henry II. I mean, it's the ultimate propaganda stroke to take all of that was working against you and to be able to turn it to your favour in an instant. And so, I think that moment, that period of a few years around Thomas's death, is when Thomas is important to Henry's story. Either side of that, I think he's much less important than history has normally allowed him to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the modern age, we tend to think that medieval rulers and others didn't understand the value of publicity and organising things, shall we say, as you've indicated. But they did, because they were clever and cunning, and they worked things out.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, we tend to still view them as quite, I think we view them sometimes as stupid. We think we're so much cleverer than people were back then. But people like Henry II absolutely understood the world that they lived in a way that if we went back to 1170, we probably wouldn't have a clue what was going on. We wouldn't know how to reach people, talk to people, communicate ideas and messages. That they would see a piece of artwork, they would see a painting on a church wall that we don't see very much of today, and they would understand exactly what that's telling them.
Yeah.
They would be able to pick out so many details from that and understand all of those messages that are in there. Whereas we'd go, I don't know, it's a guy in a garden with an apple.
Yeah, it's not a very good picture, is it?
Yeah, doesn't even look much like a man.
No, quite. Yeah.
But they would see so much in that we don't. So I think there's a danger in viewing them as somehow intellectually inferior to us. They operated in a different world, but they understood that world every bit as well as people understand this world today.
Yeah.
I've always had this suspicion that Henry II probably had something like ADHD or something, just because he was always so active. They said King John didn't spend too much time in the same place, but Henry II was always on the move.
And you wonder whether that's where John gets it from. They are very similar in that way, that they are forever charging around. I think John's problem was that he just didn't have as much space to charge around as Henry did, because he's only got England to belt around. But you see it with Stephen a little bit as well during the anarchy. And you see it with Henry II, that people are utterly shocked with the speed at which they arrive at places and the speed at which they do things. They reduce, said Henry gets this reputation for reducing castles by siege in a matter of a couple of days, when people think it'll take him weeks, if not months, to do it. And you have to wonder, is he just, like you say, that kind of ADHD element to his personality, where he is literally like charging there, sort that out, charge over there and sort that out. He doesn't want to stay anywhere and focus his attention for very long on anything, maybe because he's got so much going on, but also that's why he has someone like Thomas Becket to do all of that work for him that requires the focus and the attention to detail, because what he wants to do is tear off over there. And it's either hunting or reducing a castle or, chasing down a new right that he wants to get. And it's kind of, you do see him jumping from, one thing to another quite quickly. And that's where Thomas Becket probably compliments him as Chancellor, because he's willing to do that kind of the long haul work that Henry isn't interested in.
And it worked well, though. So with all that in mind, do you think Henry II was a successful king?
Yes. I mean, in almost every way possible. I think just the amount of territory that he controls is impressive. No one will come close to holding that much territory in Western Europe for a very, very long time. And he does it incredibly well. Yes, he's chasing down kind of sporadic rebellions all over the place, but so is everybody else with much smaller holdings than he is. I think part of his success is that he avoids this idea of empire in the kind of Roman model, or perhaps even the Holy Roman Empire model, in that all of those territories are allowed to keep their own kind of laws and culture and customs. In England, we remember him as creating the common law, but he doesn't try and spread that across Normandy and Anjou and into Aquitaine and all of that kind of thing. He's perfectly happy for them to maintain their own customs and cultures. And I think that makes it much easier for them to swallow Henry's rule, because he's not trying to change them. So I think by avoiding that idea of empire, he's able to maintain control over all of those lands very well. I think perhaps his biggest failing, maybe his only failing, is the worst one that he could possibly have, and that's in his legacy. He simply doesn't manage his relationships with his sons effectively or efficiently. I think that thing with Eleanor is about counteracting Louis's efforts to get in between them, but Louis doesn't stop. And having played that card and made Eleanor the scapegoat, they can only do that once, and Louis doesn't stop. And I don't think he ever finds a way to really counteract that, either from Louis or then from Louis's son Philip Augustus, who will carry on playing the same game with Henry's sons, really. I mean, I think Henry must have been so frustrated with his sons that, like I said before, that they couldn't see what was being done to them, the way that they were being used. But nevertheless, he doesn't manage to get through to them. He ends up being chased to death by his own son, Richard. John is probably the worst king England has ever had. Nobody has a good word to say for John. Richard, although that Whiggish kind of 19th century view of history will hold Richard up as some kind of hero, probably wasn't a great king for England, really. In medieval terms, a crusading warrior king hero, great, but left so many problems that then John would inherit and exacerbate by his rubbish personality and the fact that he was an idiot. But I guess against that, you also have to balance the fact that the Plantagenet dynasty is the longest reigning dynasty in English history. They take Henry's family name and they make it last for 334 years. They are ultimately incredibly successful despite his sons. So, I mean, I hate to think what they might have achieved if he'd managed to keep his sons on side a little bit better than he did.
Yeah, I mean, it's when we were talking to Michael Jones about the Black Prince, obviously there is a kind of parallel of Edward III having lots of sons as well. And we put forward that we agreed on the theory that if the Black Prince had become king, those brothers he had would have been a force of support for him. Yet in Henry II's reign, you don't get that sense at all that the brothers would have supported each other particularly. Any of them, really.
Well, I mean, out of the four of them, two of them die before Henry II does. Henry the young king frequently rebels. Geoffrey is, called by some of the chroniclers the son of perdition, and he's seen as the one who is frequently driving the splits between them. And then you get, Richard effectively hunts his father down into his grave, and then when Richard is king, John does everything that he possibly can to destroy Richard's kingship in an effort to get something for himself. They are not working together in a way that might have seen an Angevin empire last for generations across much of Western Europe.
Yeah, and John, of course, is egged on by Philip of France to actually cause Richard trouble.
Yeah, so Philip Augustus is there still playing his dad's game, still playing the same old thing, and it works again and again and again and again, which utterly amazes me that Henry II's sons never seem to learn.
No, and I mean the scope was there in Edward III's reign for them to fall out, because you've got Henry of Lancaster taking the throne of Castile or going for that, and there was scope there if they were going to fall out. And there was also a king of France that was, keen to disrupt English plans. But yeah, it's about the characters, I think.
Yeah, I think it is. But I also think that if you see what Louis and Philip Augustus do to Henry and his sons, it really sets a tone for Western European politics for centuries that follow. By the time we get to the 19th century, we still have this rivalry between England and France, which seems to stem from, because the King of England at the time had so many holdings on the continent, that they are natural rivals. And it's almost that the way that Louis and Philip tried to get between Henry and his sons and work against the King of England, and then get between Richard and John, kind of sets the tone for centuries of Western European politics to follow. It sets that relationship between England and France right up to the last century, probably.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even in the 18th century with the 7 Years' War, you've got them playing out that dispute across the planet, really, in different areas of geographical areas.
Yeah, and the Peninsular War with Napoleon as well. It's not until I wonder if the Crimean was the first time they were on the same side.
But were they really on the same side?
There was, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been one of the older generals actually still thought he was fighting the French, even though he was fighting the Russians. And he actually called the enemy the French.
Okay, so you've done this dual biography in a sense, as you presented it to start with. You can't really do one without the other. So having studied the pair of them, do you have a favourite out of the two? Do you find one or another of them either as an individual or perhaps as a subject of study? And the answer might not be the same for the two, but which do you prefer, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
I feel like you're taking the Louis VII role here now, aren't you? You're trying to maybe pick a favourite, trying to get between me and Eleanor and Henry.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I think they are both, massive characters with hugely impressive lives and hugely impressive achievements. Henry could have been a very significant French vassal, and he could have lived out a fairly comfortable life as Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou and not really done too much else. But he crafted for himself that kind of role as the premier political power in Europe by the end of his reign. And that's down to his drive and his hard work, and also, I guess, his partnership with Eleanor, absolutely. And I think in terms of a person to study, I think he's fascinating because you look at the way that he builds up his power and authority and the way that he maintains it, and the way that he avoids that idea of enforcing empire, because it probably seems like the easy thing to do, to take the laws and customs that you know and make everybody else adopt them because that's comfortable for me as a ruler. And I think there is some incredible political intelligence in not doing that. So I think the way that he operates is very impressive, fairly unique for the period, I think, and that makes him an interesting person to study. But Eleanor just has to edge it. I mean, in any conversation, Eleanor of Aquitaine will always edge it. But I think the thing that strikes me most about her is that I think she lives effectively 3 hugely impressive medieval lives. As Queen of France, who goes on crusade to the Holy Land, as Louis VII's wife. Then as Queen of England, who puts together this huge Angevin territory and operates as regent and builds this set of lands. Probably no surprise or no coincidence that it's within months of her death that England begin to really lose all of the Angevin territory. It stays together for as long as she's alive. And then she lives this kind of third life after Henry II dies as kind of mother to Richard, where she's charging around to Iberia to pick him up a wife, charging off towards the Holy Land again to make sure he gets married before he goes. When he gets captured, she's railing against everybody who should be, Richard is a crusader, his land should be protected, and they're not being. She tears around raising this huge ransom for Richard, and then she takes it to Germany herself. In her 70s, she's making these huge journeys around everywhere. And then even as John's mother, John becomes king because Eleanor wants it to be so. It could have been Arthur, the Duke of Brittany. Really, I think Eleanor makes the decision because John is the one who she's closer to. Arthur is a bit more, he's probably too close to the French crown. So she makes that decision.
Yeah.
Wrong decision, Eleanor. I mean, crikey, the one thing that she probably gets wrong is picking John.
Yeah, but even so, then Arthur besieges her, so she probably thought, well, I did make the right decision.
Yeah, absolutely. And when one of his few moments of victory, John comes and relieves his mother from the siege and captures Arthur, maybe she felt like she got it right at that point. But she lives this 3 kind of, if one person had lived any of those lives, it would have been hugely impressive. So for one person to live all 3 of those lives, I think just makes Eleanor stand out so much from all of her peers and from so many of the men of this period too. I think that's why she attracts so much attention and focus and admiration. She was an incredibly impressive person. So for me, she's just ahead of Henry.
You're probably not alone in that conclusion.
I think that's exactly where she should be.
Yeah, I think I'm on fairly safe ground.
Yeah, that's exactly where Eleanor should be, ahead of Henry. And I think, like you say, Henry wasn't afraid of strong women, so he probably thought so too.
I think to some extent, when she's married to Louis VII, she is viewed as a threat because of that power that she has. I think Henry is the one who is happy to embrace that and to give her free rein to be as impressive as he knows she can be. He's not afraid of that. So I think you have to give Henry some credit for how impressive Eleanor is sometimes.
Yep, totally agree. Well, thank you very much, Matthew Lewis. That was an absolutely fascinating discussion. I do have to mention it is the 22nd of August that we're recording this. The 22nd of August is the anniversary of the death of Richard III. So this is probably the only discussion today that Matthew's going to have on anything other than Richard III.
Yeah, I mean, it's a big day in a Ricardian calendar, I guess, the 22nd of August. So it's quite nice to talk about things that aren't related to the Battle of Bosworth.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It's been fabulous. Absolutely lovely to have you on.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure to come and talk about two of my favourite people from history to 2 of my favourite people in history.
So I've just realised I haven't asked, what are you working on at the minute, if you can say?
My next book is several things. I'm working on a second edition of my Survivor of the Prince and the Tower book, which is just updated with some more research and a bit more information and things like that. My next book is kind of a sequel to this. So it's about Richard I's time in captivity. And that kind of felt like the natural place to go, having written about Henry and Eleanor's efforts to get Richard free. It was just to examine his time in captivity, what that meant to him, what that meant for England, what that meant for John, the fallout from all of that, how that period has perhaps shaped our view of Richard as a king, perhaps unfairly. I've also got a biography of Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the Kingmaker, lined up for a little bit down the line. And I've also, I feel like I've been saying this for a very long time because it's been stuck, but I'm kind of 95% of the way through a historical fiction novel about Jack Cade's rebellion, which I'm hoping will be kind of an into a cycle of fictional books about the Wars of the Roses. So.
Oh, I recommend that.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't need to talk to anybody else about wonderful historical fiction for the Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, because it's given me a lot of mileage, this has.
Yeah, it is one of those periods that everybody's always fascinated with, isn't it? The Wars of the Roses.
Yeah, I mean, I always say that I think anyone who's interested in the Tudors, it's simply because they're lazy, because Tudors are easy.
Yeah.
There's nothing too complicated goes on there. If you want real complexity, go to the Wars of the Roses, because you'll spend your life trying to understand it, and you'll always find something new.
Yeah, that's true.
To talk about.
Yeah. Well, it was good to talk about this topic rather than that, but yeah.
Yeah, it's been fabulous. Thank you very much, Matthew.
And good luck with all that great long list of books you're doing.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
So thank you very much to Matthew Lewis for a fascinating discussion on Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Do join us next time when it will be just Derek and myself. We'll be looking into the life and career of Christine de Pizan, the first woman ever to make a career out of writing. Thank you very much for joining today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. I've been Sharon Bennett Connolly.
And I'm Derek Birks. If you've enjoyed the podcast, why not give us a review or a rating and perhaps subscribe so that you don't miss the next one. Thanks for listening.